Young folks are voting with their feet, and they are literally telling us this education is not relevant.
I had a learner a few years ago who had said, I'm dropping out. And they're like, well, I'm willing to be your half days, but the other half days, I want to go do my passion.
Sometimes the student's day starts at 5 o'clock in the morning and the bus is waiting, so it definitely is a sacrifice. But, almost nobody regrets the experience, and they feel like they can navigate the real world and walk into spaces that are primarily white without fear of not belonging.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, how could America's schools work better for more kids?
When I got to Northern Cass, we were a really successful system in terms of standard metrics. High test scores, about 90% plus of our kids going to 4-year college.
Corey Steiner has been the superintendent of Northern Cass School District for about a decade.
We're located about 25 miles northwest of Fargo, North Dakota, surrounded by cornfields on all sides.
It's a tiny district, just one school building with about 700 students from kindergarten through 12th grade. And like he said, things were going well when he came on board. But then he had one of those through-the-looking-glass experiences. Or if you're a Matrix film fan, he took the red pill and saw what was happening at Northern Cass in a new light.
The moment for me was in a graduation ceremony about my second year in. We're still small enough where you can put the PowerPoint up and you get to see the kid's face. They show the baby picture, then they show the picture of the senior, and everybody goes, ooh and ah. And then they say, hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm going to North Dakota State University for Engineering. Everybody kind of, oh, yay. And we had a learner get up there and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, and I'm going to work on the farm. And you could hear an audible sigh come from people like, oh. And you could just see people kind of run in their minds wondering what went wrong during this learner's time in our school district. We had programmed him for what we thought the world needed, not what he needed. We had never bothered asking him, what do you want to do when you walk out of this building? What do you want to become? And if we would have done that, the whole pathway would have changed in terms of how we created an educational journey for that learner.
So instead of requiring him to take the math, science, and language courses that would prepare him to do well on college entrance exams, Northern Cass could have been guiding that future farmer through the math, science, and language of crop yields, soil health, and irrigation. We failed him, thought Steiner.
I was like, we got to tear it down and start all over and create a system that is based on experiences and based on learners having say and ownership in the path they take to get to where they want to go when they leave our building.
There's a strange thing in the polling data about education in America. Parents of school kids consistently say they are very satisfied with the education their own children are getting. But more broadly, Americans say they're very worried about where education is headed. And the actual achievement data suggests that worry is warranted. In 2024, an historic percentage of 8th graders tested below basic proficiency in reading on the standardized test known as the nation's report card. 4th graders on that same test hit a 20-year low. And just FYI, the test only looks at 8th and 4th graders as a gauge of student performance more broadly. We know the pandemic caused a huge dip in scores across the board, but what these latest test results clearly show is that students are not making up that lost ground. And the students who were most behind to begin with have fallen even further behind. So the gap in scores between the highest and lowest performing students in U.S. schools is growing. And it's compounded by the fact that schools in the United States are starkly divided into those with mostly low-income, struggling students, and others in wealthier neighborhoods with more resources and better outcomes. On top of all of that is the new problem of a nationwide epidemic of absenteeism. More than a quarter of K-12 students are chronically absent, meaning they miss at least 10% of the school year. That's nearly twice the norm from prior to the pandemic. It's a grim picture, but There are lots of people trying to make school work better for more American children. So today on Top of Mind, we're going to explore 3 areas of active education reform. And we'll break it down like this. Would attendance improve if students had more control over how they spent their time in school? Would children master the basics of math, English, and history better if every skill came packaged in a topic they were excited to explore, like Greek mythology or outer space? Would the achievement gap shrink if struggling schools were more racially and economically integrated? Let's dig in. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised that after spending so much time during the pandemic learning from home with all the flexibility that offered, kids and their parents are not so convinced being at school every day matters. But school teacher turned education reformer Janae Henry Wood thinks there's an even more important message embedded in their absence.
Young folks are voting with their feet, and they are literally telling us this education is not relevant. We have said this over and over and over again, and now we're going to show you physically with our bodies we're not coming.
And yet, Wood says that when you do sit down and ask kids what they want from school, it's also clear that
young people want to go to school. Like, they want to be around their peers. They want to be social. That's really important. But it matters what they're doing there, you know? And that's the thing that we've got to get really crisp and clear, is that when we get young folks in our doors, we've got to create learning experiences of meaning, of purpose, because young folks do want to come to school. But what we actually have them doing in many instances isn't worth doing. And that's why we think design is such a centrally important concept for us to be focusing on.
Now, this idea that education has been intentionally designed to work the way it does was actually a light bulb moment for Janae Henry Wood early on in her career, when she was working as a teacher and then as a staff researcher at the education nonprofit Teach for America.
I studied hundreds of classrooms, and over, whether I was in the Bay Area, Eastern North Carolina, New York City, Chicago, no matter where I was generally always seeing the same thing. I was seeing a hardworking teacher at the front of a classroom with 28 minimum to 35 kids looking up at that teacher, all doing the same thing at the same time on a bell schedule. You move with your same aged cohorts through a set curriculum where you're all getting tested at the same time. Whether you know knowledge or can do something different or not, it's time to move on.
That uniform design is no accident, says Wood. It goes back 100 years to the moment when America was shifting from a rural economy where families worked their own fields and their kids sometimes went to school if their village had one.
So we had a decentralized system of village schools. And what we found is that as the country was industrializing, this was late 19th century, early 20th century, it became really hard in our country to know, what does that high school degree enable you to do versus what that other high school degree enables you to do? Could they read? Could they do basic calculation? It created a lot of disequilibrium in the system.
So progressive reformers thought, hey, let's standardize education for the workers this new industrial economy needs in its factories making steel, cars, and consumer goods. And to design the schools for those workers, they looked to the factories themselves, where tasks were broken down into small steps, done in precise order to churn out one identical Model T after another.
And so we actually grafted on the metaphor of how a car is built to the metaphor of how learning happens. All of that had a real purpose at the time. And I think it's really important for us to understand and honor what those purposes are and what it got us to. One, it got us to really high literacy rates. It got us to young people being able to go to school from a young age all the way up until 18. Education had been quite spotty for young people throughout. That then enabled people to access new opportunities and new jobs in cities that they were not able to access before. And what we have actually learned in the last 15, 20 years with neuroscience, with developments in cognitive brain science and child development, is that learning learning doesn't actually happen in this mechanized way. It's extremely customized, it's extremely social, but our schools haven't caught up. We need a new system and a new structure, and what's going to be at the core of that is having learning be relevant, having it be deeply customized, and having our young folks work towards larger goals that really keep them excited about learning and keep them engaged.
These days, Janae Henry Wood is Chief Learning Officer at the education consulting firm Transcend, which was founded by some of her former Teach for America colleagues. In their new book, Extraordinary Learning for All, they profile several schools they've worked with to challenge this industrial-era design of education. One of them is Northern Cass in North Dakota, where Superintendent Corey Steiner realized at that graduation ceremony years ago that the school had become a finely tuned factory for churning out just one thing, a college-bound graduate. So now, says Steiner,
we're in year 8 of what we call our transformation to create choice-ready learners, college, career, military, and not care which one, as long as they were able to have their first choice.
It's built around a system they call studios.
Our studio model is a co-designed learning experience. I had a learner a few years ago who had said, I'm dropping out. So we sat down with them and said, well, what would your day look like if you didn't drop out? What would it be? And they're like, well, I'm willing to be your half days, but the other half days I want to go do my passion. And I said, well, what's that? And they're like, I want to be a farrier. I want to put on horseshoes. I want to work on the farm. And in our previous model, it would have been like, no, you're going to take government, you're going to take world history, you're going to take Algebra 1, and we would have created a dropout. We would have created, not the learner created that. And instead, he said, let's try something different. And so we actually said, yeah, you come here for half days. We'll do the studio model. We're going to do your math and your English around this idea of becoming a blacksmith, becoming a farrier. And in the afternoons, you're going to go out and you're going to intern with a farrier. You're going to be able to work on the farm. And that learner not only graduated, but when they graduated, they also started their own business. They're highly successful right now doing this work and also doing what they're passionate about. And it was simply because, 1, we asked, 2, we listened, and 3, we realized that learning outside the building is as important of what occurs inside the building.
Northern Cass now offers studios to all high school and middle school students. And it's different from just letting kids opt out of subjects or cutting them loose to work part-time or do an internship. At Northern Cass, the studio experience is their school experience, right down to how they meet the basic math, English, and science criteria that are required for graduation. Take that student who wanted to be a farrier, says Steiner.
He was doing tons of math in the farrier business. And so there was a way to articulate credit for that. He was going out and visiting with people and communicating his business plan. There's a way to articulate credit for that. Granted, you have to be a little creative when you first start, but pretty soon you were just like, oh yeah, this actually aligns perfectly to what we've been doing in these classes.
Is this like a one semester thing, or is it their entire high school?
Typically, our studios are lasting a minimum of 6 weeks, sometimes much longer. We've had some go multiple years, and we've had some go quicker because it's about what the learner dictates. So it really is dependent on how deep of learning they want to do. Sometimes it's dependent on the credits that they need to get, if it might be a recovery model. And sometimes it's dependent on, you'll see a kid that'll dig into something and say like, I thought I'd like this. I don't. So I'm going to finish out the next few weeks, call it good, and then move on to a new topic.
And the studios, what do you offer? Is there like a suite of options that you offer your students?
Purely designed by the kid with the educator. So if I'll give you just 2 quick ones. One was a young lady who was really interested in ceramics. And so for her chemistry course, she helped design and make her own glaze. And learned chemistry through the ceramics process and started her own business. And now they do the flea market circuit. They go all around the whole area and they're selling. They have a very strong business that they've created. That's what she wanted. Another young learner was really interested in zombie books. And I would think, well, how's that a studio? Well, she started writing her own book. They are required to get an expert. They are required, not us. And she got an expert who had written like 45 zombie books, and she did an interview with him. And when that interview got done, I sat in on it. It was amazing. And when it got done, he's like, let me know when you're done with the book. I'll just work with you to get it published. So like it is truly what kids are passionate about, giving them an opportunity to dig deep in there. And then our job is to figure out where does it connect in the traditional model of credit bearing.
Dr. Steiner, has it been difficult to convince the community, though, the parents of the students that you don't need to be focused on a college education as the pinnacle?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I would say right away when we started our transformation, there was this belief that we were just saying college doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. And I think what we have gotten people to understand is every pathway, college, career, or military, plays a role and can play a role in any learner's life. And so it's been crystal clear that if your learner wants to be college bound, we're going to provide every experience with a robust dual credit program to get you there. If your learner wants to be military bound, we're not going to have the first time you get involved with the military be when you go to sign up. We're going to make sure that we have the National Guard out here running PT and OT with all of our kids. We're going to give you a chance to go on to the camps and see what that looks like and talk through actual basic training scenarios. And if it's going to be career, we're going to get you an internship. We're probably going to get you paid while you're doing it, and we're going to do it during the school day. When we started to help people realize that it was truly about the experience and that every kid should still get their first choice, then it wasn't about buy-in, then it was from the community. It was about a commitment to doing what is best for each learner.
So your graduation rates have improved, it sounds like, your completion rates, but what about your test scores?
Yeah, test scores, I think we were 13 of the 15 areas well above state average last year. And that's what I will tell you without putting any emphasis on test scores. We simply say, take the test, you have a skill set that we focused on, and typically they're getting a deeper level of learning right now because they're invested in the learning. They're not being told what they have to learn. And we got rid of percentage and letter grades, and I think that was a huge, huge change.
If we can pause on that for one moment, you're saying you don't give grades to your students.
We don't give percentage or letter grades. We give proficiency scores. So when we went to a model that like you're proficient or you're not, that helped us very much know this is what a kid knows and doesn't know. And then it allowed us to build structures in place to support getting them to that point or letting them go above and beyond that point.
And I love the way you frame that, Dr. Steiner, as we grade young folks on what they know, not what they've done. You know, and this goes back to the industrial model that we spoke about, Julie, at the top. So much of the grade also includes, did you come to class on time? Did you turn this in? Did you turn that in? Did you comply with the things that we've set up? No one is saying that those are a bad set of habits and skills to learn, but we can over-index on the compliance aspect of the grade as opposed to actually saying, what does this young person know? What are they able to do? The second thing that I love about this story is that listen to how many times Dr. Steiner said we asked them. We asked them and they told us and we listened.
Now, in the book that Janae Henry Wood co-wrote with her colleagues at Transcend, this push to de-industrialize the design of education doesn't necessarily look dramatic. If your kid goes to a magnet or charter school, the studio concept at Northern Cass might already sound familiar to you. What's too often missing, though, say Wood and her co-authors, is close involvement from the community in the design choice. They highlight an example of a public elementary school in Washington, D.C. that was struggling with behavior problems and classroom disruptions. After listening to students and parents, school officials realized the solution was not tougher discipline. Their students were navigating trauma and adverse experiences related to poverty and family instability. So the school created daily routines that foster safety and connection. And their classrooms now have centering spaces where children can go to practice the emotional self-regulation skills they've learned.
I think in the old regime, we would say, what is a school doing? Great, that's perfect. Package it up and ship it off to the next one. That's one of the most important things that I think we've learned from this process is we can't simply copy and paste solutions. Studios was a solution that is working for Northern Cass in their time, in their place, in their context with what they've heard parents and young people saying that they wanted. That's the approach we've got to take in every school community across the country.
As Janae Henry Wood travels the country asking students what they want, 3 themes emerge.
Make learning relevant, make it deeply enriching, allow me to customize it and have a say, and I'm in. And what I have found is that kids have a range of things that they want to be exposed to, that maybe they've seen on the internet, maybe they have seen a YouTube video of someone living in some far off place in the world, and they want to learn more about it. Their lives are so much bigger now than young folks' lives were when we were growing up. And so really giving them that opportunity to explore those things that they're interested in, it matters tremendously. The second thing is that young folks are saying, we want the opportunity to work together. They want to collaborate. They want to solve problems together. Third is that young people want to belong. And we as educators, I think, have a real task in front of us to create schools of love and belonging. And that authentic love and belonging and community and connection can come through learning really hard stuff together. It does not have to be one or the other.
Janae Henry Wood is Chief Learning Officer at Transcend. We also heard from Corey Steiner, Superintendent of Northern Cass School District in North Dakota. So retooling education to be less cookie cutter and more relevant for all students is one trend in school reform. Next, let's hear how some schools are moving away from the typical elementary school approach to teaching kids specific skills, one subject at a time throughout the day.
We're blending all of those things together around a common theme so that the knowledge is sort of what's binding all those other skills together. But it's not separating out like this is your reading class, this is your social studies class, this is your science class.
Okay, but what really is the difference between teaching knowledge versus teaching skills in separate subjects? We'll find out next. This is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Hey, it's Julie. There is another podcast I think you're going to like from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, so I wanted to pass along the word. It's called In Good Faith. Join host Stephen Cat-Perry as he connects with believers from various religions, Christians, Buddhists, Jews, Muslims, and much, much more. Listening to their captivating stories is an opportunity to deepen our own understanding of faith, religion, and spirituality. Plus, Stephen is really well-traveled, and his global perspective brings a unique richness to each conversation. Elevate your appreciation for the divine with In Good Faith. It's an inspiring journey of unity and enlightenment. Listen anywhere you get podcasts. Russ Williams took over as CEO of Center City Public Charter Schools in Washington, D.C. about a decade ago with a clear challenge.
When we looked at peer schools when I was hired, we were near the bottom of the list.
Center City runs 6 publicly funded pre-K through 8th grade charter schools. They're small, typically just 1 class per grade level. The student body is predominantly Black and Hispanic. So first day on the job, Williams went looking for some answers.
After visiting all 6 campuses, 2 per day, my first 3 days, one of the first things that became readily apparent, and some of our really good teachers also hopefully pointed this out, was we were operating with a bunch of programs, but we were not operating with a curriculum.
As one principal told him,
we have 60 classrooms teaching 60 different things. If we wanted to get the schools to collectively improve, we had to put a curriculum in place that was, challenging and rigorous. And I was convinced, based on the research, that we definitely needed to focus on building students' knowledge and filling in the gaps. And so focusing on a knowledge-based curriculum.
This concept of knowledge-based curriculum has been around for decades, but it is having a moment in the U.S. right now. And Center City was ahead of the trend. It's based on research that shows readers understand text better when they have background knowledge in the subject. One famous study took a bunch of middle schoolers, some with high reading scores, some with low, and had them all read the same passage about baseball. The kids who were huge fans of baseball were best at understanding and recalling the text, even if they were typically not good readers. Now, taking that one step further, research has also shown that kids who score high on general knowledge tests, so they know a lot about a lot of different things, are better readers overall. A knowledge-building curriculum, then, aims to systematically grow the knowledge that students have about the world. And that's opposed to the more common approach in U.S. schools, which focuses on teaching skills one subject at a time. Now, I asked Kate Merrill, the director of curriculum at Center City Public Charter Schools, to flesh out this traditional approach just a bit more.
Sure. So what you might find are very distinct blocks of time. Like this is when we're going to be doing writing, and we're going to be writing around some prompt. And now once we're done with writing, we're going to shift over to reading. You are going to be reading books on your reading level in these small groups, and we're going to be discussing how to find a main idea. And then after that, we might move into grammar.
And the priority during each block of time is to master the skills or memorize the information that's required by the state and measured on year-end tests. Now, with a knowledge-building curriculum like Center City uses, the school year is divided into themes that last several weeks, and virtually everything the kids learn is rooted in that theme during that period of time, which might be something like the 5 senses for kindergartners, seasons and weather for second graders, or outer space for third graders.
In 4th grade, we have a module on the Revolutionary War. But instead of just learning, dates and key battles and key figures, they're learning about the Revolutionary War through literature and art. So they're reading the novel Woods Runner by Gary Paulson as their anchor text. They are also looking at a nonfiction text called George versus George, which shows the different perspectives of the 2 Georges, George Washington and King George, and help students develop skills around, point of view, to draft persuasive responses around what were the different perspectives of the Boston Massacre and how does this piece of art paint us one picture versus this other picture. So they're learning how to read the text, and they're doing very, English language arts types of skill building activities, but they're also learning a lot of background knowledge around the Revolutionary War. And by doing these things together, they are better able to understand words that might be above their reading level when they come across them in a text. And if you have them write around a prompt that depends upon their background knowledge and the text that they're reading, then you've sort of leveled the playing field. Like everyone in this classroom has now been given the same knowledge base. So now you all have this depth of understanding from which to draw your response.
And that is important because the achievement gap that is so persistent in U.S. schools is related to how much reading and general knowledge kids are exposed to at home. One study in 2023 followed a bunch of Colorado kindergartners in a knowledge-building curriculum all the way through 3rd grade, and they saw that gap close. Students from low-income families did as well as those from high-income families on the state standardized tests, which is a little surprising when you think about it, because those year-end standardized tests don't usually give students reading excerpts about the specific themes that they've been studying during the year. But Center City CEO Russ Williams says it's worked out for their students.
As long as we're pushing and challenging our kids in our classrooms every day, they'll do fine on standardized tests. And that has largely borne out itself over the last 4 or 5 years for us. When we look at how our schools are doing relative to other schools, we're near the top of the list.
It's worth mentioning that switching to a knowledge-building approach can be tough for teachers because it's often a far more rigid curriculum. The texts and the order of instruction are set, and there may no longer be room for the books or the classroom activities teachers have refined and relished doing with their students over the years. Plus, and this is important, in this polarized moment of book bans and deep disagreement around things like diversity and race, it can be an enormous challenge to get parents, politicians, and teachers all on board with the same system that goes all in on a finite set of topics kids will explore during a school year. So why not just keep the focus on specific skills, divorced from any content or theme that could create disagreement? Well, here's what Russ Williams says when other schools call and ask whether it's worth the potential risks.
I mean, I think our pitch is that knowledge-based curriculums work, and that the more challenging and more rigorous materials you put in front of students and have them grapple with, like the more they will impress you in terms of what they're capable of doing. One of the other problems in schools is people have low expectations and people are not believing kids can do work. But when you put really challenging material in front of kids and let them grapple with it, more often than not, they will actually find a way through it and sometimes with the teacher's help and scaffolding, but they get through it, and that helps them learn more difficult concepts and helps them build confidence. So I think that's something that we really try to impart upon people. The higher the standards and the stronger the curriculum, the better your kids are going to do.
Russ Williams is CEO of Center City Public Charter Schools in Washington, D.C. Kate Merrill is Center City's Managing Director of Curriculum and Instruction. Okay, so finally, let's turn to one of the biggest drivers of this persistent gap between the best performing students in the United States and those at the bottom.
Yeah, our schools today are actually more segregated racially than they were in the 1970s. And if you look at socioeconomic segregation, that has actually been rising steadily. And we have yet to see an example where we could make segregated environments truly have equal resources and equal opportunities and outcomes for students.
Next, we'll hear how more and more communities are trying to turn that around with school integration policies. I'm Julie Rose. This is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. Hey friends, I would like to take just a moment and introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's The Lisa Show. Lisa Valentine Clark is the host. She's a comedian, actress, believer, single mom. And the show delves into the multitude of challenges that shape our lives, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, social issues. Lisa and the Council of Moms will tackle it and do it with a lot of laughs along the way as we attempt to figure out this thing called life. So check out The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get podcasts. In America today, kids are learning in seas of sameness. Just think about the last school you visited. Chances are most of the students in those classrooms had a similar racial and economic background. More than 18 million public school kids in the United States, that's 1/3 of all the students in the country, go to a school where 75% of the student population shares the same race or ethnicity. And the trend is similar for economic background, too. Children from poor neighborhoods are clustered in their own schools. Wealthier communities have theirs. And the data is clear that schools with more students who come from higher income families, which also tend to be majority white schools, consistently have more resources and better outcomes.
Which a lot of people don't realize, because a lot of people think about Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 and think that we tackled that problem.
This is Hallie Potter.
I'm the Director of Pre-K-12 Education Policy at the Century Foundation.
In her work tracking school segregation trends, she's noticed a surge in communities adopting intentional integration policies.
We are seeing a minority, but a growing, exciting group of places, school districts, charter schools, and housing organizations that are all interested in promoting integration in their schools and neighborhoods.
But why didn't Brown versus Board fix it?
I think if you want to understand why our schools are segregated today, I think you need to understand 3 parts of the story. The first one is the story of school segregation in the South. And that's the story that's mostly told in our history books, right? That we had Jim Crow era segregation in many Southern states and in some non-Southern states too, that explicitly said Black students could not enroll in all white schools. That was the law. Brown versus Board of Education set a new law of the nation that we would not deny students access to public schools based on their race or ethnicity. Mm-hmm. And what happened after Brown then is there were decades of federal work to desegregate those schools in the South. And that was hard and messy work. There was a lot of resistance from many folks in the South. And some of the ways that was done was far from perfect. It put the burden of travel usually all on Black students, and many Black teachers lost their jobs. The Black schools were closed. But for all of that imperfection, it actually did create much more integrated schools in the South. And we saw a lot of benefits for students coming out of that. Increased enrollment in college, better earnings for students, better health outcomes. But then what happened starting in the late 1970s, and part of the reason that we are more segregated now than we were then, was that the federal government really pulled back from integration. And in many places in the South, we saw resegregation. Court orders were lifted, places went back to neighborhood school assignment, and we saw that racial and socioeconomic segregation really climb. So the South is really the story of desegregation and resegregation.
And the federal government pulled back from enforcement. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yep. And then there's a separate story in the North, right? So the story in the North is that there typically wasn't this kind of legal segregation that said, in the law that Black students could not attend these schools. Schools were what we call de facto segregated. They didn't have policies that were explicitly about race, but they were still really racially divided. And after Brown versus Board, there was this big question about whether the federal government was going to do anything about all of this de facto segregation in the North. And basically, the way it turned out was that the North largely got off the hook. And so that has meant that, for many places in the North that have this de facto segregation, that has just continued. There was never a serious effort to integrate.
And this de facto segregation is driven primarily by what?
It's driven primarily by housing. And that's the third piece that I think you really need to understand. That's the story largely of redlining. So going back to the 1930s, there were federal policies to help people buy houses, and race was an explicit part of which neighborhoods were deemed worthy and safe bets for federally backed mortgages. And now that policy is no longer on the books, but the legacy of that still shows up in the way neighborhoods look today. And even though we don't have racial discrimination in our housing policies, we do still have a lot of socioeconomic discrimination. We have exclusionary zoning policies that make it hard to build more affordable housing units in different neighborhoods. So all of those forces combine to shape who actually gets access to which neighborhoods. And that matters because most students in this country are going to their local neighborhood public schools. 70% of kids are going to their assigned public school. And so housing policy is school policy.
But how do we explain then high-performing majority Black schools, for example, high schools with high graduation rates and high academic achievement? If integration is so critical, doesn't that really suggest that it has more to do with something else? Like maybe it's not the fact of mixed race, it's the fact of high quality curriculum or high quality teachers.
Yeah, the power of school integration doesn't mean that it's not possible to have high levels of academic success in an all-Black school. And in fact, even before Brown v. Board, we saw some really powerful things going on in some of the all-Black schools and all-Black educators doing amazing work. We often think about, trying to separate out, is it integration or is it resources? But the thing is, those are braided together. And that's what Brown v. Board was really about. Brown v. Board said that separate is not equal. That we never found a way, we have yet to see an example where we could make segregated environments truly have equal resources and equal opportunities and outcomes for students. So one of the big powers of integration is as that lever for creating equal resources and equal opportunities.
Can you tell me a little more about how integration works as a lever to get more resources into a school?
It happens through both bigger structural ways in which schools are funded and down to individual decisions. So at the structural level, a lot of the segregation that we see is between school districts. And the way that those schools are funded typically is that the bulk of that funding is coming from property taxes. And so in lower income districts, not only do you have less wealth and property tax to build off of, but then you also end up having to have higher property tax rates in order to get enough money to fund schools. So it ends up being really inequitable, and you don't have the same access to resources as you do in a wealthy district with high property values and that's bringing in a lot of money that funnels directly to the schools. Mm-hmm. But there are also kind of smaller, more personal decisions that affect the resources that segregated versus integrated schools can have. High poverty schools have high levels of teacher turnover. And one of the factors is that when you have a school that has many students who are coming in with the challenges of poverty, it can be, in many ways, a harder teaching job. It can be something where teachers burn out faster. When you have more integrated schools, that helps level that that factor. And then, the other ways that the resource equity can come into play is through very individual small things like PTAs. When you have highly segregated schools, you tend to have more affluent schools that are raising a lot of money from their parents, and sometimes, the parents reaching out to community organizations for, that money that funds all the extra stuff that we all want for our kids, right? To have the arts program, even when it was, cut by the district, or to have that after school program, or to be able to have, these community nights. Again, if you have more integrated schools, you don't have these big differences in how much different schools are able to raise and what that actual student experience is like.
Hallie Potter and her team at the Century Foundation have identified 185 school districts and charters across the country with active integration policies that consider race or socioeconomic status in student assignment and admissions. Now, in practice, the focus is almost entirely socioeconomic diversity because the Supreme Court has largely outlawed race-based policies in the last 20 years. And Potter's research shows the majority of integration efforts have two other things in common. They're voluntary and lean heavily on school choice.
School choice is a really important part of the story because it's played a role both in segregation and in integration. It depends on the type of school choice. So, we have research that shows if you have school choice without diversity as a goal, just kind of a free market school choice program where you maybe have open enrollment across school district lines, that type of choice tends to increase segregation. The families that have the most access to resources, both the information, how to navigate a system like that, and also sometimes the financial resources and supports that make it possible to attend a school outside their neighborhood, especially in places where you might have school choice, but you don't have transportation to the schools, and that's up to families. That type of choice tends to increase segregation. But choice has also been a really important tool, and I think is one of the best tools for promoting school integration. Magnet schools were created really with the goal of being an opportunity to bring together students from across different neighborhoods with a theme that would be exciting and make it worth folks to travel a little farther than your neighborhood school to go to a school that maybe has a science theme or has an arts theme. And to do that in a way where diversity was part of the mission, that we're going to look at all the different students who are applying for the school, and we're going to make sure that we're getting a mix that's representative of the diversity of our community as a whole. There are charter schools that use this model too, that are intentionally diverse, and they recruit populations and might have weighted lotteries. So they're reserving a certain number of seats, for example, for low-income students to make sure that they get a socioeconomic mix in their schools. So it's a double-edged sword. I never want people to think that school choice is the problem or school choice is the solution. It's about the priorities that we build into it.
But, says Potter, the biggest barrier to meaningful school integration nationwide is something that no amount of innovative school choice or focus on diversity within a district can actually solve, because
interdistrict segregation is the biggest part of segregation nationwide. It's especially big in the Northeast, and where we have these tiny little school districts and extreme segregation across school district lines. We see this really high degree of polarization. It is incredibly challenging to address interdistrict school segregation because one big reason is the Supreme Court case, the 1974 Milliken versus Bradley case, that said that there would be no federal role, essentially, for enforcing integration across school district boundaries. So that has meant the efforts that have been successful at school district interdistrict integration have largely been either voluntary efforts or ones that have used state constitutions and state tools.
One of the longest-running examples of an integration policy that crosses district boundaries actually checks both of those boxes. It's voluntary and state-backed. It's called METCO.
Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity. My name is Millie Arbaje Thomas, President and CEO of METCO Incorporated.
So METCO was founded in Boston in 1966, which was about 10 years after Brown versus Board. Boston, like many cities across the country, was dragging its feet on school integration. So the Massachusetts legislature passed the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965, outlawing segregation in public schools. When Boston's school leaders still refused to integrate, a group of Black Boston parents connected with a group of white parents and school officials in suburban districts to start Metco.
And by that September, 220 students got on buses to go to 7 communities in the suburbs. And now we're 3,200 students in 33 communities. But it all came out of the motivation and the work and the organizing and the deep desire of parents who wanted better for their children.
Metco's longevity, going on 60 years now, is due in large part to the fact that it's funded by the state of Massachusetts with an annual appropriation of around $25 million. The money goes to suburban districts that agree to admit children from Boston's mostly Black and Hispanic public schools. Families in Boston who want to have their kids bused to the suburbs put their names in a lottery for the handful of Metco seats that open up each year. Arbaje Thomas sent all of her own kids to one of Boston's closest suburbs, called Brookline, through Metco.
It was really important to have a well-rounded opportunity for my child. For example, in Brookline, you get to take language in kindergarten. You have music, you have instruments, and these are all required courses. These are not optional. So my children have been doing sports, and they've been doing school plays since they were little. They picked up the flute, they picked up the viola, they picked up the ukulele. They've been speaking and practicing Spanish since they were 5 years old. And, sometimes these are things that are not 100% available in all of the public schools in an urban setting because they have so much more that they have to address.
Now, her kids had a short drive to Brookline, but Arbaje Thomas says the average bus ride is over an hour each way.
Sometimes the Metco students' day starts at 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 and 5:30, some of them already in the buses waiting. So it definitely is a sacrifice. That is an understatement. But, almost nobody regrets the experience that they have received, and they feel like they can navigate the real world and walk into spaces that are primarily white and feel like they belong, and that they can enter those spaces without fear of not belonging.
So where do these seats come from in these schools? Does it become a situation where they have to save a certain number of seats for Metco kids, and that might mean that a white kid from the neighborhood in the suburb won't be able to go to their neighborhood school?
Yeah, so that would never happen because the suburban students have first access to their community. That is their community where they live. So we are called a marginal seat program, which means we never go where there's not any available seats. So when you think about 3,000 students divided up in 190 schools, you're talking like my daughter was only accepted with one more student in her entire school of 700 in that kindergarten classroom. So 2 students will never overcrowd a classroom. And that's typically how it is. It's so spread thin. You still can barely see a student of color in some of the classrooms these days.
Well, if it's... I was gonna mention that Boston's schools have been resegregating steadily since the 1980s,
yes,
just like much of the rest of the country. And so, even though you've had the Metco program for all of that time and beyond, what does that say, do you think, about the efficacy of a program like Metco to really make a difference?
Well, what that says is that we haven't solved the problem. So, when we're talking about our neighborhoods and gentrification and still dealing with neighborhood lines and in district lines, and right now even in Boston, there's some neighborhoods that don't even want to build housing, near the trains and near commuting lines, and there's a lot of opposition around that. So, we're in a stage in our nation right now where we're still hurting and we're still recovering from so many decades of just injustices. But what I can tell you is that we just had a research that just came out, a 20-year research that came out from Tufts University. And it showed that not only are we graduating at faster rates than those who did not get into the program, we are actually going to college, graduating from college, and making more income than those who applied and did not get in. So already the program has proven that it does make a difference for students of color. And she also, looked at the impacts that it had on suburban students, and there was no negative impacts on the suburban students who are exposed to this diversity. When you speak to many of the suburban students, they said that they would never have met a student of color if it wasn't for the MECO program, and that they feel more prepared to be in a diverse workforce in their future.
The successes that Millie Arbaje-Thomas describes for METCO in Boston reflect a common theme with integration efforts across the country. Students who participate benefit, but most students don't even have the chance. To really expand the benefits of school integration, Hallie Potter of the Century Foundation says we'll have to challenge some of our most basic assumptions about how schools are organized.
We've started to treat school district boundaries like they are some, sacrosanct map handed down from heaven. But, the truth is they were just created, often created in the context of policies like redlining and like our transportation decisions of where highways got built that themselves have a lot of history of racial discrimination. And there's no reason that those lines, should have to be where they are. One of the wilder proposals that's been thrown out there that, I kind of love is, what if we redrew school district boundaries every 10 years, the same way we redraw congressional boundaries, right? It wouldn't need to be the case that they become such gatekeepers of opportunity. Now, of course, enacting that would be a big change and would really require, I think, shifting the way that people think about how housing and schools are connected. So often now people are buying their homes really because they're buying their way into a school district. And so it would take a shift of mindset to think about public education as a different type of public good and not something as focused on, the ability for a family to pay their way into a particular school district.
Yeah, but that mindset shift is also the kind of the tension we constantly see in a very individualistic society, right? This, deciding, sort of being willing to let go a little bit of control over getting the best for me and mine in order to allow for maybe something that's better for us all. It's a constant tension we struggle with.
It is. And I think in the conversation about school integration, that's part of why it's really important to start with everything we know about how these diverse learning environments are beneficial for individual students. I don't think it's a case where we need to think about, trade-offs or my kid versus society. We know that having the chance to interact with students who are going to come from different backgrounds, have different perspectives, all results in better social emotional skills, better cognitive skills, preparing students to be more competitive in college and in jobs. And so I really think, as parents are thinking about the individual choices that they are making for their kids, it's important to see that value that diverse schools can add.
Hallie Potter is Director of Pre-K through 12 Education Policy at the Century Foundation. We'll put a link to her research on integration policies nationwide in today's show notes. And there's so much more to consider around the topic of school integration. It's a far more complicated story than most of us realize. So we'll actually be doing an entire episode of Top of Mind about that in the coming months. Stay tuned. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we covered today. Are there changes to the way the school day runs that could have made a difference for you or for your kids? If you're curious about what it looks like to eliminate letter grades for high schoolers, we did a whole episode of Top of Mind about that, too. You can find a link in the show notes. And what do you think about the knowledge-building approach to school, where kids aren't spending the day learning specific skills in isolation? Instead, they're diving deep into a specific topic and picking up skills along the way. I would love to hear your thoughts. Send an email to topofmind@byu.edu to join the conversation. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Vanessa Goodman and me, with help from James Hoops, Samuel Benson, Isabella Sosa, and Sam Payne. Our sound design team includes Lauren Sandberg and Brandon Lewis. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.